Welcome to another AVID Chat. David Harpole and Jack Arnold on a Sunday, Tuesday. Actually, today's Wednesday. We're recording it the next day after, but good to see you, Jack.
Good to see you, Dave.
So welcome back to, this is part 3 of our 5 degrees of freedom, as we're calling it. And our first 2 sessions, what we talked about was, first and foremost, having some sort of vision and purpose, how important that is so that we just have direction into what we're trying to accomplish in life. And it doesn't just have to be financially, but in general, what you're really trying to do. Last week, we talked about being you incorporated. And what we meant by that was taking a look at your personal finances as though you were a business. You receive income, you have expenses, and there's something left over. Where does that go? Are you tracking it, monitoring it? And most importantly, is it lining up with the vision in step 1? So those 2 things are complete. We now say in this part 3, the most important thing is protecting you and yours. And it does sound like insurance, and we'll probably talk a little bit about that, but I think it's best kicked off, Jack, with the question is, why is it important in the first place to talk about the what ifs in life?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I think it's, let's say, you've gone through the first 2 degrees, you've done a lot of the work. We talked even in the first video that, getting an idea of where you're headed, what the purpose is not easy. And it does take some time. You have to go back to it frequently, probably. Things will change over time, but just getting going is difficult. You roll into the second degree and you've done a pretty good job of knowing where your cash flow is going. So you've done the first 2 steps of knowing where you want to go, kind of getting an idea of where you are, directing your resources. You're kind of on top of that. And then you've done all this work, you're putting all this effort in, but there's always kind of those unknowns out there that you can't really control. They may or may not happen to you, but if they did happen to you, it would be devastating. Whatever you would define as devastating. The easy one is always, you die unexpectedly. If you're a younger person, any person really, I mean, if you're 35 years old, 40 years old, and you're saving and doing your thing, you're not really expecting, I'm going to pass away soon. You're thinking, I got a long way to go. But if something was to happen to you unexpectedly, it would be devastating, especially if you have people relying on your income and these kinds of things, but also just for whatever you thought your vision was. If you're looking out far enough, it obviously stops at that point. There's no going beyond. So, it does permanently change. You wouldn't want to do all this work, start working towards something and never have an idea of what could go wrong, I guess is the easy way to say it.
Right. So really, you do have to have an understanding of the vision to even know whether or not these what ifs are going to have any impact.
Yeah, sure.
Because some of it is going to be some sort of planning, and maybe it's, we'll talk a little bit about some insurances, I think, here, but even the basic things of estate planning documents, which I would say that 95% of people that we've talked to over our professional careers haven't had these things in place. And it's not so much, like you said, if you die, it's kind of like, well, if I'm dead, I hate to say this, but kind of who cares type of thing. But it's more if you're alive and something happens, if we're in a relationship, or I'll use myself as an example, and something happens to me and Melissa needs to make decisions on my behalf because I can't, but I'm still here.
Yes.
There needs to be legal documents in place. And I would say as a young family, we have 2 little kids, that's super important to make sure that those things are in place.
Right. Yeah. And that's not even, that's not insurance. Everybody hates insurance. That's not insurance in the sense, but it is maybe some assurance that if something does happen to you, if you don't die, let's say, but you are temporarily, hopefully, incapacitated, you can't make decisions, you can't do things, heaven forbid if something happened to both of you, who takes care of the kids and who pays the mortgage and, what are all these things? God forbid it was to happen. Having those things taken care of isn't, I would say that's assurance. I don't want these things to happen. But if they did, they wouldn't permanently derail my life, assuming I came back from it and ended up okay. but I have these things in place. So this goes back to you've done all this work, you have a vision, you're saving your money, you're doing all this stuff that takes time and effort, but to build this thing up, you don't want something to come along and derail it permanently if you can try to help it. Whether that's using insurance or not, or just having some documents in place, or even just having a plan as to if this happens, this is how we would handle that, so that things don't kind of blow up. So
yeah, and I think this is an area that we're firm believers and supporters of other professionals. You know, we don't do legal documents, we don't sell insurance. We know enough to be dangerous, but a lot of times we'll refer those professionals to help assist clients in making sure that the proper things are done. A lot of times you can get online and do things, but man, I could probably see how to do ACL surgery on a YouTube video, but that doesn't mean I'm qualified to get in there and do it. So you should rely on professionals.
I'm a huge advocate for using people. Yeah. I think if you're going to get some stuff, if you're talking about estate documents, obviously, you're going to get these things drawn up, you want to do them properly. It's not, I wouldn't say it's cheap. It's not as cheap as like a LegalZoom thing, I guess, but it's not insanely expensive either. Relatively speaking, depending on how much wealth and income you have, it can be somewhat inexpensive. Getting a good professional to draw these things up ahead of time saves a lot of headaches, probably saves a lot of money. And if you get a good, attorney to draw these things up, they're usually great about being resources if something actually happens. They're great for that. So you establish a relationship with somebody that can help. Not, they would know you, but you can always say, hey, something happens to me. Here's the attorney's information. Go to them. They'll help you, figure some of the stuff out. So I'm always a big advocate for using attorneys and professionals for sure.
So that might be a good step one in the protecting you and yours. Just assess what documents, if any, you have in place that would give someone else direction or the ability to help make decisions or fulfill your vision. I'd say the second thing is, it really is the insurances. Do you have enough insurance in place? And there's a gazillion of them. I don't want to run through every single one of them. The easy one is, life insurance. If I die, do I leave Melissa something? And I would say one way to look at life insurance is, do you need to replace your income for someone else, like me, again, in a family situation? If I pass away, I would like Melissa to have some replacement of income to, move on with their life. She married for love the first time, so I told her the second time, go for money.
Good advice.
But, that would be life insurance. But there's plenty of other ones that are probably more important than life insurance, really.
Yeah, life insurance is kind of it's like the ultimate insurance, I guess. It's completely unexpected that you would pass, but if it happened, clearly it's devastating. Like it's a huge hit. It also is, depending on what kind of insurance, we're not going to go into that, but again, it can be somewhat inexpensive to insure yourself if you were to pass away, relatively speaking, for the benefit that you would get if it was to happen. It can be somewhat inexpensive to insure against something like that. But there's also like health insurance, which is just like a mess, of course, which is a totally different, it's almost like a prepayment plan. So it doesn't, we call it health insurance, but it's not really insurance in the sense that you're guarding against some risk that may or may not come. You're just kind of prepaying. So health insurance is a different animal altogether. So that's not always the best example, but even things like disability insurance, if you, let's say you've done all this work, vision, you got some cash flow going. A big part of your cash flow is, I have this money, I'm saving and investing it, likely. And a big part of, especially early on, and usually we're talking 10 years, the most important thing you're doing is saving the money. That makes the big difference, kind of building that base up so that the compounding effects start to really go in your favor. But that takes a while. What you're trying to do in the beginning, just build a base of savings so that you can actually get some compounding later on. So if that stream of income, that stream of savings was to stop or something, that's not great, because that's a big part of how you're building things. You can guard against that by using some kind of disability insurance. This is more or less valuable depending on what your profession is. If you're in a very I wouldn't say niche, but like a niche type of profession where you're doing the great example is always you're a surgeon, you're working with your hands, make a lot of money, get in a car accident, smash your hands up, a la Doctor Strange type Marvel comic book type thing, and you can't work on anybody. Well, listen, that's bad. There's not much that's going to get you the same amount of income as working with your hands as a surgeon. So, you can insure for those kinds of things. But even if you're not like that, you just work in a job and something was to happen to you unexpectedly, even if you're just out for 6 months and you can come back, like that's a long time to not get any income. That's something that you can insure against. Again, it depends. It can be somewhat inexpensive depending on your income, how all the details that you put into it. But a lot of times employers provide those kinds of insurances, and it tends to be relatively inexpensive to do that. So that's something that you might want to look to take advantage of.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. If you do work for an employer, a lot of larger employers, and really even some small employers, offer those types of benefits, kind of pennies on the dollar. You might be able to replace your income 50, 60% for $12 a paycheck. I don't know. It's pretty inexpensive because it's group policies, so they lump everything together. So you get your estate docs in place, you assess your current insurances and the need, how that matches with your vision and what you ultimately want to protect. And then the other thing that is, I guess, maybe not necessarily step 3 in that order, maybe it's even step 1, is having some sort of like cash reserve, right? If the hot water tank goes bad, do I have $2,500 accessible quickly without penalties to replace that? Or it could be any number of things. But as a homeowner, there are known expenses, but we don't know when they're going to happen. And that would be I want to protect me and mine against that and make sure I have the cash available.
Well, listen, COVID's a great example. I mean, there's just things that happen that you're not really expecting. I mean, I don't know that you're not really going to plan for COVID, even to the depths of what COVID could have been I'm sure for a lot of people. Obviously, everybody was affected differently, but those are the kind of things like if stuff comes up that you're not necessarily expecting, having a cash reserve, it doesn't need to be a year, although it could be depending on what you're doing, but it's having some kind of cash reserve at the very least, just to give yourself some breathing room to adjust and change things around if it ever came to it. If you have 3 months of living expenses set aside as like some kind of assurance that if something happens to me, I have some breathing room. I have a few months before this gets really dire. I can that doesn't mean that it's solved in 3 months necessarily, but I give myself some breathing room. I can figure something out instead of, high wire act. I need this to go right all the time. Otherwise,
so then how do you know what is the right amount of, let's call it, cash reserve to have?
I mean, you can use rules of thumb. So I guess the CFP curriculum would say something like, do you have investment income? Yeah, right. So do you have multiple sources of income? That's one thing to consider. Does your spouse work? There's like a 2-income household. That's something to consider. What are your monthly expenses? If they're half of your income, well, maybe, that extends it for, what is your profit margin? We talked about this in the last videos. That gives you a little bit of breathing room. Typically they would say rules of thumb would be something between 3 and 6 months. Some of it is comfort. If you're comfortable having 6, do 6. If you're comfortable having 12, do 12. If you're in a business or a profession where you're getting paid like a per project thing, so that could be any number of things. You're a graphic designer, you're an artist, or you're a freelance writer or something where, you're kind of going from project to project. You have these big swings in income. Keep that in mind. How long could you go between jobs where you would need to have a cash reserve to kind of smooth out your income? These are all things to consider. It's hard to give a do this type of answer. It's kind of gauge your own situation. But having a cash reserve is good.
I think that last point, that it's almost like the marketability of yourself could drive a lot of what you need along with your comfort level. I've never once met an unemployed CPA, right? So if you're in that profession, you could say, well, I can get a job tomorrow. I'm not worried about it. Whereas if you're, like a graphic designer or some like niche thing where it might take 3, 4, 5, 6 months to actually find a new job, that would be something to consider as well. So definitely a variable is what you do and, what's going to give you rest at night too. I think that's super important. You don't want to be stressed out about not having enough. And I will say, to tie this back into the last session, if you're not familiar with what you're spending and where it's going and the cash flow of your enterprise, it's going to be really hard to know what that amount is.
Yeah, exactly. That's why these things all kind of build on themselves. Is, if you have an idea of where you're going, you have a good idea of what your cash flow is, then when you get to this, maybe some of these things are working in parallel. You're doing all these things at once, but it's much easier to have an idea of, all right, this is how much I know I need to have for a few months in order to, get over some kind of hiccup in things. You're just more aware of what's going on. It's easier to make those decisions. We've made the comment in the past. It tends to be a little bit of a puzzle. You know how to solve it. Oh, I know I have this coming in, this comes in. But when you haven't done those other steps, those first 2 degrees that we talked about, you don't know where you're going. You're kind of random. There's no real purpose. You have no idea where your cash flow is going. Money comes in. It goes out. You could maybe stare at the ceiling and guess as to where it goes, but you don't really know. It's going to be very difficult to know. Like, how much insurance do I need? Do I need, how long, like disability insurance will have like a exclusion, like 30 days, 60 days, 90 days. You're going to be disabled for a certain amount of time before the benefit kicks in. The further out you kick that, the cheaper the insurance is. Well, how far can you kick it out? Because if you can kick it out 6 months because you have enough cash for 6 months, well, that'll reduce the cost quite a bit. But if you have 30 days, well, then so these things all kind of build on each other. So it's good to have that other stuff situated for sure.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think it's a good summary. You got to start with the vision. You have to understand the cash flow of your personal enterprise, yourself, your finances as a business, and then assess protecting yourself, your family. What are your options? What's the right amount? It all takes some time, but they all go hand in hand because ultimately that's what's going to help give you this, what we're saying, degrees of freedom.
Right. And we do have another video if you want to go back. If you're watching this on the channel, we talked about how to be a better investor, which we're eventually going to get to investing your money. But part of that video was talking about how to be a better investor is having all your affairs in order. It's easier to take risk and invest and manage the ups and downs and fluctuations in your account that inevitably come when you have these other things taken care of. Part of that is knowing that, if something happens to me, I don't have to sell all my investments at the worst possible time in order to meet my current obligations. Like all of these things go hand in hand. So even though insurance sucks, and this is like probably the most boring thing to do because you feel like, I'm outlaying all this money, I'm getting like seemingly no return. In fact, the best outcome is I get no return because I really don't want any of these things to happen. It sucks. It's like the worst because you feel like you're just putting money out and not getting anything. But it's super important because we have enough clients that we've had things unexpectedly happen. It might not happen to you, but if you have hundreds of people, eventually you run into situations where even if it's 1% of people, you get a few people that it happened to, and none of them expected it to be them that it happened to.
Yep. No doubt about it. Well, thanks for joining us for part 3 on 5 degrees of freedom. Join us next week where we talk about compounding and the impact it can have over time. Jack, is always good to see you. Check you next week.